What if I told you that the wisest man in the Bible ended his life looking at everything he had built and feeling a bitter taste of waste? Would you believe that someone who received divine wisdom, unparalleled wealth, and worldwide recognition could still lose what is essential? Before answering, imagine the scene. A king surrounded by gold, gleaming palaces, lush gardens, absolute power in his hands. And at the same time, an inner silence that echoes louder than any applause. Like we are talking about Solomon, the wisest man in the Bible, the one who wrote Proverbs, who judged justly, who had a direct encounter with God and asked for something few would ask for: wisdom. But how did the wisest man in the Bible waste his life? And more importantly, how do you avoid wasting yours? Perhaps you think that wasting life is linked to failure, poverty, or lack of opportunity. But Solomon's story shows exactly the opposite. He had opportunities that no one else had. He had access to truth, profound spiritual knowledge, and supernatural discernment. He began his journey with humility, recognizing that he needed direction. And that is precisely what made him extraordinary. However, here is the point that almost no one realizes. Wisdom is not the same as constant vigilance. Knowledge does not replace character. Understanding principles does not mean living by them. And it is in this invisible space between knowing and practicing thus that many begin to waste their own lives without realizing it. How many people today accumulate information, consume content about purpose, success, spirituality, personal growth, but continue to make decisions that sabotage their own future? How many times have you known exactly what you should do, and yet still chosen the most comfortable path? The story of the wisest man in the Bible is not just an ancient account. It's a mirror, and it's a silent warning about how someone can conquer the external world and little by little lose their inner alignment. Solomon built the temple, organized the kingdom, brought prosperity, wrote about prudence, discipline, and fear of God. He understood the importance of guarding one's heart. He taught about not being led astray by wrong influences. But the question that begins to echo is, why can someone who knows so much still fall? There's a dangerous detail in the journey of anyone who achieves success, recognition, and power: the feeling of being in control. And when that feeling grows, vigilance decreases. Small concessions seem harmless. Strategic decisions seem intelligent. The mind justifies, the heart relaxes, and the deviation begins almost imperceptibly. No one wakes up determined to waste their own life. Waste happens in installments, in subtle choices, in priorities that adjust silently. And that's exactly why this story is so powerful for those who wish to live with purpose, meaning, and coherence. Now, I want to involve you in this. Have you ever stopped to think if there's any area of your life where you know what's right, but you're putting it off? Have you noticed how it's possible to talk about principles, advise others, even inspire those around you, and still neglect details that, in the long run, can be costly? The journey of the wisest man in the Bible doesn't begin with a fall. It begins with brilliance. It doesn't begin with error. It begins with success. And perhaps that's exactly where the greatest danger lies. Because when everything seems to be going right, that's when you least suspect that something might be going wrong. And it's at this delicate point in the story that we need to look more closely, because it is precisely at this delicate point that many stop paying attention. When life is comfortable, when results appear, when people praise, when the feeling of stability creates a false sense of security, the heart begins to relax. And it was in this way, step by step, that the wisest man in the Bible began to distance himself from what he himself taught. It wasn't overnight. It wasn't with a great immediate scandal. It was with small decisions, seemingly strategic alliances, choices that seemed justifiable. He knew the warnings. He knew the principles. He had discernment. But knowing is not the same as being vigilant. And here's something you need to understand deeply. The greatest tragedy isn't the lack of knowledge. It's the disconnect between knowledge and practice. Solomon wrote about guarding the heart, about not straying, about prudence. He advised others to avoid dangerous paths. However, when he began to allow influences that slowly shaped his priorities, the deviation happened almost imperceptibly. This is the kind of waste that doesn't make a sound at first. It disguises itself as progress. It dresses up as success. It presents itself as expansion. And when you realize it, what was central has become secondary. That's why it's so important to understand what we're talking about here. It's not just an old story. It's not just a theological reflection. It's a direct warning about how someone can have wisdom, talent, opportunities, and still compromise their own legacy. If you truly understand this content, if you absorb the principle behind this narrative, you begin to develop something that goes beyond information. You develop awareness, and awareness is what prevents the silent waste of one's own life. I want you to actively participate in this reflection. Don't just watch passively. Think, analyze. Ask yourself, is there any area of my life where I'm relying too much on myself? Is there any decision I'm justifying, even knowing it might distance me from my values? Write the word vigilance in the comments if you understand that wisdom needs to be accompanied by daily discipline. Or comment consistency if you realize that knowing isn't enough. You need to live it. This isn't just engagement, it's a stance. And if this content is making you reflect, if it's opening your eyes to something you may never have noticed in this way, leave your like now. An like shows that this type of message needs to reach more people who are living on autopilot, accumulating knowledge but perhaps neglecting its application. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe. Because here, we're not just telling stories. We're extracting practical principles, profound lessons, and warnings that can redefine how you see your own journey. Understanding the story of the wisest man in the Bible means understanding that danger lies not only in ignorance, but in excessive self-confidence. It means realizing that true waste doesn't begin when everything goes wrong. It begins when everything seems to be going too well. And it is precisely from this point that the story begins to reveal consequences that many did not expect. Let's return to that pivotal moment that completely changed the trajectory of the wisest man in the Bible. The night was silent, and the weight of the responsibility of governing an entire people rested on the shoulders of a young king. And then something extraordinary happened. God appeared to Solomon and asked a question that any human being would like to hear at least once in their life. Ask for whatever you want. There were no limits. There were no hidden conditions. He could have asked for immeasurable wealth, absolute power, victory over enemies, longevity, eternal fame. He could have asked for everything that many today desperately seek. But what he asked for reveals the heart of that moment. He asked for wisdom. He asked for understanding to govern, discernment to lead, the ability to judge justly. This request immediately transformed him into the wisest man in the Bible, someone who became a reference point for intelligence, strategy, spiritual depth, and mental clarity. And this is where admiration is born. Because whoever asks for wisdom shows maturity. Whoever asks for discernment demonstrates responsibility. The right decision at the right time opens gigantic doors. From there, Solomon prospers, organizes the kingdom, establishes peace, builds, writes, teaches. The wisdom he receives is not common. It is extraordinary, recognized even by foreign kings. He becomes a symbol of knowledge, a reference of leadership, an example of successful governance. But while everything grows on the outside, a question begins to arise on the inside, albeit silently. Does wisdom guarantee emotional preparedness? Does knowledge ensure constant obedience? Does understanding principles automatically mean living according to them? Here is the tension we need to face seriously. Wisdom is a powerful tool, but the human heart remains a territory that demands daily vigilance. It is possible to have intellectual clarity and at the same time neglect emotional discipline. It is possible to advise others with excellence and fail in one's own decisions. The request was right. The intention was noble. But having access to the truth does not mean being immune to temptation. And this is the central question that will guide everything from now on. Is it possible to be extremely intelligent and still waste one's own life? Perhaps the greatest danger is not ignorance. Perhaps the greatest danger is knowing exactly what is right, and yet choosing the wrong. Think about this honestly. How many times have you been fully aware of the correct path, but decided to bend the rules? How many times have you understood a spiritual principle, a value, a clear direction, and yet postponed its practice? The story of the wisest man in the Bible begins with an admirable request, but it also compels us to reflect on something deeper. Wisdom without vigilance can become excessive self-confidence. Knowledge without continuous humility can open invisible breaches. This is the sensitive point. The heart can be unprepared even when the mind is sharp. The inner self can be vulnerable even when the external image conveys security. And it is precisely in this contrast that the silent risk of waste resides. If you understand the weight of this, write in the comments, "Wisdom is not enough," or simply "daily vigilance," to show that you realize that intelligence and purpose need to go hand in hand. Because what happens after this request reveals something that few are prepared to see. Solomon didn't start off on the wrong foot. He started admirably. Young, wise, humble enough to ask for understanding instead of wealth. He built the temple with precision, organized the kingdom strategically, and brought about a prosperity that seemed undeniable. The borders were secure, the people lived in stability, and the fame of his wisdom spread across nations. It was the portrait of absolute success. Everything seemed aligned: purpose, intelligence, spirituality, and power. But that's precisely where the silent danger lies. When everything is working, vigilance decreases. When prosperity increases, spiritual sensitivity can begin to weaken without anyone noticing. Political alliances emerged as strategic decisions. Marriages to foreign princesses were diplomatic agreements, guarantees of peace, expansion of influence. Nothing seemed wrong at first glance. On the contrary, it was intelligent. It was political. It was rational. But small, invisible concessions began to infiltrate the structure that seemed so solid. He knew the warnings. He knew what was written. He understood the law. Even so, he allowed exceptions. And every downfall begins with a well-justified exception. It didn't happen overnight. There wasn't a dramatic announcement saying, "Now I'm stepping aside." It was gradual, subtle, imperceptible. An altar here, a permission there, a relaxation that seemed harmless. The brilliant mind that organized the kingdom began to negotiate principles. And when principles become bargaining chips, the soul begins to lose strength. The heart that was once whole begins to divide. And this is where it stops being just ancient history and starts to resonate with you. Because great falls don't start big. They start small. A decision that seems too strategic to question. An agreement that seems too intelligent to refuse. A concession that seems too small to cause harm. You don't wake up one day far from your purpose. You drift further away millimeters at a time. Perhaps it's that choice you call just this once. Perhaps it's that environment you know doesn't strengthen you, but you keep going to. Perhaps it's that relationship you justify because it brings some immediate benefit. Small, invisible concessions. Small, almost imperceptible deviations. And the problem isn't the size of the decision. It's the direction it points. Solomon didn't lose everything at once. He gradually lost his independence. Each alliance seemed isolated. Each choice seemed manageable. But repeated choices build destinies. And destinies don't change suddenly. They change through silent constancy. Solomon reached a point that almost every human being believes to be the pinnacle of life. Wealth accumulated beyond imagination. Palaces erected with impressive detail, gold circulating as if it were commonplace, political influence, spiritual power, recognized authority. He had wisdom, he had recognition, he had status. In anyone's eyes, he was in absolute control of his own history. Nothing seemed to escape his grasp. And it is precisely here that this story begins to touch on something much deeper within you. Because success, pleasure, and power create an almost hypnotic feeling of dominance, as if life were finally obeying your commands. He experienced limitless pleasures. Parties, grand constructions, gardens, vineyards, servants, music, entertainment. He decided to test everything. Nothing was left out of the experience. It's as if he said to himself, I will test every possibility the world has to offer. And for a while, it works. Pleasure deceives. Achievement distracts. Recognition feeds the ego. The feeling of control grows. You begin to believe that the more you accumulate, the more secure you are. The more you conquer, the more complete you become. But there is a silent difference between being busy winning and being truly satisfied. It is at this point that the book of Ecclesiastes becomes a powerful emotional turning point. After experiencing all of this, after achieving what many would call ultimate fulfillment, he writes something that seems like a shock. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity, a chasing after the wind. Do you perceive the weight of these words? It wasn't someone frustrated who wrote this. It was someone who got there. It was someone who won, and yet still felt the emptiness. This shatters one of the greatest human illusions, that external success guarantees inner peace. There's a troubling paradox here. You can conquer the whole world and, in the silence of your room, feel you've wasted what's essential. You can receive applause and still carry a sense of emptiness. You can be at the top and discover that the view doesn't fill your heart. Solomon didn't fail because he didn't succeed. He failed because he achieved everything and realized it wasn't enough. And perhaps that's the most uncomfortable reflection of all. The worst kind of failure is the one that comes after success. It's when you realize you climbed the right ladder, but leaned against the wrong wall. It's when you understand that you mastered strategies, accumulated resources, built influence, but lost connection with purpose, with meaning, with that which truly sustains the soul. That's the illusion of control, believing that managing results is the same as governing the heart. Solomon recorded words that have endured for centuries. Phrases about prudence, faithfulness, self-control, fear of God, wise choices, and safe paths. He wrote about guarding the heart, watching one's steps, avoiding seductive shortcuts, and standing firm in the face of temptation. However, there is an uncomfortable detail in this story that many ignore. Writing about wisdom is not the same as living wisdom. There is a chasm between accumulating spiritual knowledge and allowing that knowledge to shape daily decisions, invisible habits, and silent attitudes. It is possible to speak beautifully, quote verses, advise friends, guide children, give inspiring speeches, and still fail in governing one's own soul. Accumulating wisdom is like filling shelves with rare, organized, underlined, and annotated books. Internalizing wisdom is allowing each page to descend into the heart, confront pride, break old patterns, and transform repetitive behaviors. A person can know principles about fidelity and still negotiate small concessions. They can talk about prudence and continue making impulsive decisions. They can teach about fear of God and, at the same time, allow the ego to guide important choices. This contrast reveals something profound about human nature. Knowing is not the same as obeying. Between advising others and governing oneself lies a silent battle. It's easier to see the mistakes of others than to confront one's own inconsistency. It's more comfortable to explain the right path than to walk it when no one is watching. And this is where the story ceases to be just about Solomon and begins to directly affect you. How many times have you known exactly what you should do, but postponed it? How many times have you heard a powerful message, felt the need to change, promised you would be different, and days later returned to the same pattern? How many times have you accumulated spiritual knowledge, watched videos, read texts, highlighted phrases, but failed to transform it into practical action? There's a phrase that needs to resonate heavily within you. Knowledge that doesn't translate into action becomes silent condemnation. Because every ignored truth hardens the heart a little more. Every piece of advice not applied creates a distance between who you know you should be and who you actually are. And this distance, over time, generates frustration, guilt, and spiritual stagnation. True wisdom isn't measured by how much you know, but by how much you practice it when no one is watching. Now pay attention, because this isn't about theory. It's about real practice. About not reaching the end of your life looking back with that silent emptiness that no one sees, but that corrodes you from within. Solomon had wisdom. He had wealth. He had influence. He had respect. He had everything that many people today call success. And yet, little by little, he distanced himself from what he knew to be right. It wasn't all at once. It wasn't with one scandalous mistake. It was in small concessions, seemingly harmless decisions, choices that seemed strategic, but that were misaligned with his own principles. And that's exactly how most people begin to waste their lives. Not for lack of talent, not for lack of opportunity, but for lack of inner vigilance. The first pillar he neglected was constant vigilance over his own heart. The heart here isn't fleeting emotion. It's direction, intention, and deep motivation. When you stop observing yourself, when you stop questioning why you're doing what you're doing, when you start justifying small inconsistencies, something begins to shift within you. And almost no one notices it at first. That's why a wasted life doesn't begin with visible failure. It begins with a heart that's too relaxed. Ask yourself honestly, what has been guiding your decisions lately? Ambition? Vanity? Fear? comfort? If this part resonated with you, write in the comments, "I will watch over my heart," because this phrase is more powerful than it seems. The second pillar is consistency between principles and decisions. It's useless to know what's right and act contrary to it when pressure, power, or immediate pleasure arise. Solomon knew the principles, but he began to negotiate convictions in the name of alliances, interests, and desires. And here's a profound point. Every time you act against what you believe, you weaken your own identity. Gradually, your conscience becomes quieter. The discomfort diminishes, and you begin to normalize what you previously condemned. The disconnection grows, and the greatest danger is not making mistakes, but becoming accustomed to making them. Think about this calmly. Is there any area of your life where your decisions no longer reflect your values? If so, simply comment with the word consistency as a silent commitment to yourself. The third pillar is clear boundaries, even when you have power. Especially when you have power, because power amplifies who you already are. If you don't establish internal boundaries, power exposes your weaknesses. Solomon didn't fall because of external weakness. He fell because of a lack of internal boundaries. And today this applies to everyone. The more autonomy, money, influence, or freedom you gain, the more emotional discipline and self-control you need. Without boundaries, talent becomes a trap. Without boundaries, opportunities become distractions. Without boundaries, achievements become vanity.